The first winter I told myself it was a bear. I know how that sounds. I have been a wildlife officer in the Ouachita Mountains for 26 years, and I know what a bear does around a structure. And I know what a bear's sign looks like in the timber edge, and I know the difference between a bear track and something that is not a bear track. But when you find something you cannot put in a category, your brain reaches for the nearest available category and holds on, and for about 3 weeks in November of the first winter, I let it hold on. It was easier. It did not stay easy. The cabin is off a Forest Service road in the Ouachita National Forest in western Arkansas, about 11 miles from the nearest town with a gas station. I built it in 2003 on a parcel I bought from a timber company that had finished its cut and was offloading acreage. Second growth loblolly pine on the ridges, hardwood in the creek drainages, white oak, red oak, hickory, and a creek bottom running along the south edge of the property that holds water year-round. I had been looking for that specific combination of features for almost a decade before I found this piece of ground. I knew what I wanted, and I was patient about finding it. My name is Gordon Estep. I retired from wildlife law enforcement 2 years ago after the third winter. And what I am about to tell you is part of why. Not the whole reason. I want to be precise about that. I had other reasons, knees mostly, and the cumulative weight of 26 years of work that requires you to hold two things simultaneously. A genuine commitment to the land you're protecting, and a genuine cynicism about most of the people you encounter on it. That combination does not sustain a person indefinitely. The third winter was the last winter, and the encounter was part of why the third winter broke something in me that I had not finished putting back together by the time the retirement paperwork went through. The Ouachita Mountains are old country. Not dramatic in the way the Rockies are dramatic, like no granite towers, no glaciers, no 10,000-foot ridgelines. What the Ouachita has is age and density. The terrain folds back on itself, hollow after hollow, ridge after ridge, the hardwood canopy so complete in the creek bottoms that the understory is nearly bare. Timber rattlers and copperheads in the rocky draws, black bear population running among the highest density in the southeastern United States. The heat in August does not break at night, and the cold in February has a specific wet quality that gets into gear in a way that dry Rocky Mountain cold does not. I have worked this country for nearly 3 decades. I know its animals, its terrain, its weather, and its people, in roughly that order of reliability. The first sign came in November. I was at the cabin for a long weekend. I go out 4 or 5 times a year, usually alone, for the specific quality of silence that country produces when you have been in it long enough to stop expecting anything from it. I walked the south fence line on the second morning, which I do as a matter of habit to check for any evidence of trespass or poaching, and I found a section of the fence line that had been disturbed. Not damaged. None of the wire was broken. None of the posts were down. Disturbed. The ground on both sides of the fence was compressed in a way that indicated something large had crossed it, and on the north side of the fence, in a soft patch of soil near a white oak root, there was a track. One track. Partial, the heel impression the clearest part. I have cast and measured more tracks than I can count across 26 years of wildlife work, and I stood over that impression for a long time before I got down on my knee and looked at it closely. The heel was round and deep, the pressure distribution indicating significant mass forward of my estimate for a black bear. Wrong morphology for elk. We do have elk in isolated pockets of the Ouachita, but the track morphology is unmistakable, and this was not that. The impression was large. I did not have my kit with me. I went back to the cabin, got my measuring tape, and my camera came back. The heel impression measured 6 inches across. A large black bear heel in soft ground runs 3.5 to 4 inches across, and the toes on a bear print are set in a distinct arc with claw marks above them. I was not looking at claw marks. I was looking at a partial impression of what appeared to be a flat-footed, five-toed track with no claw evidence, pressed into the soil by something that weighed more than any black bear I have encountered in 26 years of work. I photographed it. I did not cast it because I had not brought plaster and the ground was too dry for a clean impression anyway. I noted the details in my field notebook, measured the heel, took 6 photographs from different angles and went back to the cabin. Then I told myself it was a bear. The second sign came 4 nights later. I was asleep in the cabin. It is a single room, wood stove, no electricity. I use a headlamp and candles. And I woke at some point in the small hours to a sound from the east side of the structure. Not a sound that required identification, a sound that required assessment, something large, close, making contact with the exterior wall of the cabin. Not striking it, leaning against it maybe, or pressing something against the logs. A slow, deliberate pressure that I could feel as a faint vibration through the sleeping platform. I lay still and I listened. The sound, the sensation more accurately, lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Then it stopped. Then it moved. I could hear footfalls moving north along the east wall, deliberate and heavy, and then nothing as whatever it was passed the corner and either stopped or moved into the timber on the north side. I did not go outside. I want to say that plainly. 26 years of wildlife work, an officer's sidearm on the shelf beside me, and I did not go outside. I lay in the dark and I listened for a long time and nothing further happened. And at first light I went around the exterior of the cabin and looked at the east wall. The logs were undamaged, no claw marks, no scoring, but at the northeast corner, where the east wall meets the north wall, there was a clear handprint in a patch of mud that had accumulated at the base of the corner log from the previous week's rain. A handprint, 5 fingers, wide palm, the thumb set low and the fingers broadly splayed. The span from thumb tip to the outside of the little finger was just under 10 inches. I measured it twice. My own hand spans 8.5 inches at maximum spread. I photographed it. I noted it in the field book. I went back inside and made coffee and sat at the table and thought about it for a long time. What I was thinking about was the nature of what touching a wall is. A bear does not touch a wall to feel it. A bear investigates structures through smell, and it interacts physically with structures by trying to get into them or by marking them. Scratching, rubbing. What I was looking at on that corner log was not a mark left by an animal trying to get in, not a territorial scratch, not a rub mark. It was a handprint left by something that had pressed its hand flat against the log surface. That is a gesture. That is a thing you do when you are finding out what something is made of, what it feels like, what its texture and temperature and resistance tell you about it. I have thought about that handprint more than I have thought about almost anything else in the 3 winters of this account. It is the thing I come back to, not the track, not what happened in the 3rd winter, which I will get to. The handprint at the corner of the cabin, which was the first moment I understood that whatever was investigating my property was doing so with something recognizable as curiosity. I went home at the end of that weekend and I did not tell anyone what I had found. Not my supervisor, not my colleagues, not my brother Raymond, who is the person I tell most things to eventually. I went home and I thought about it alone for several months. That is a pattern I recognize in myself. I am not a man who processes things by talking about them. I process them by sitting with them until they settle into something I can hold steadily, and then sometimes I talk about what I am now holding, and sometimes I do not. I came back in February. Snow on the ground, which the Ouachita does not get every year, and in that particular February had gotten twice. 6 inches in the 2nd week and then another 4 in the last week of the month. Fresh snow over old, the old snow with a crust on it that held weight. I walked the property on the first morning and I found the trail. It came from the north, out of the dense second-growth pine on the ridge above the cabin. The tracks were clear in the snow, bipedal, a stride I paced at between 58 and 62 inches, the impressions deep enough to tell me about mass and clear enough to show me the toe morphology. 5 toes on each print, no claw marks. The heel wide and round and set deep. The trail came down the ridge, crossed the north fence line, walked the east perimeter of the cabin at a distance of roughly 15 feet from the wall, went around the south end and then returned north up the ridge the same way it had come. It had walked around my cabin in the snow. At some point in the night, something had come down off the ridge, circled the structure I had built and live in and sleep in, and gone back up. I stood in the snow in February and I looked at that trail and I did not reach for bear. I followed the trail up the ridge as far as the terrain and the light allowed, which got me about 200 yards into the second-growth pine before the slope steepened and the canopy closed and the track became harder to follow in the reduced light. At the point where I stopped, the trail showed a pause. The impressions deeper at the toe. The weight distribution shifted forward, the marks of a stance rather than a step. Something had stood at that point on the ridge and looked back down at the cabin below. The cabin is visible from that elevation through the winter timber, the log walls and the metal roof and the stovepipe. Whatever had come down in the night and walked the perimeter had stood on that ridge and looked at it from above. I went back to the cabin and I sat at the table and I wrote in my field notebook for 2 hours. Every detail I could recall from both visits measured and sequenced. The track dimensions, the stride length, the handprint measurement, the approximate weight estimate based on snow compression. The dates and times as precisely as I could reconstruct them. I wrote it the way I would have written an incident report because that is the framework I have, and it was the framework that allowed me to look at it without the noise of interpretation. Just the facts as I had observed them. Then I wrote one line at the bottom of the page that was not an incident report. It is watching me. I did not return to the cabin until the following November. That was the second winter. I had spent the intervening months doing what I do with things I cannot categorize, which is to read everything available. I found the BFRO documentation for the Ouachita region, which is more substantial than I expected. The Ouachita Mountains and the Ozark Plateau to the north represent one of the more consistently reported areas in the eastern United States, with accounts going back to the early 20th century. I found academic papers attempting to apply biogeographical modeling to the question of whether a large, undiscovered primate could sustain a viable population in the hardwood forests of the American South. The answer, in papers not written by credulous people, was, the habitat is sufficient, the food resources are sufficient, the terrain provides sufficient cover. What is insufficient is the evidence base. There are accounts, but accounts are not evidence by the standards those papers required. What I could not stop thinking about across those months was the Roger Patterson fieldwork, not the film. I had watched the Patterson-Gimlin footage shot October 20th, 1967 at Bluff Creek, California, the same footage that has never been definitively explained or debunked in nearly 60 years. But the years of documented activity Patterson reported from the Blue Mountains of Washington State before the Bluff Creek filming. He had been tracking sign, collecting reports, building a picture of an animal's presence in a specific corridor for years before he got the footage. The footage was the culmination of a long period of careful observation in terrain the animal had been using for longer than the observation. That was the shape of what I was sitting with. Not a single encounter I could file away, a pattern in a specific piece of country that I had been working and living in for 20 years, and something in that country that had apparently been watching me at least as long as I had been finding its sign. I had a handprint measurement and a series of track measurements and 2 years of field notes. That was not evidence by the standards the academic papers required, but it was evidence by my standards, which are the standards of a man who has spent 26 years determining what happened in places where nobody was watching. And I knew what I had. I also spent part of those months thinking about institutional silence, not the silence of individuals. I understood why individuals went quiet. I had seen the professional costs applied to a colleague years before who had filed something he should not have filed in writing. I understood that silence. What I was thinking about was the systematic silence, the way official wildlife management in the United States is structured to produce non-encounters with something that the structure has already decided does not exist. Reports get rewritten. Tracks get attributed to known species regardless of what the morphology shows. Officers learn quickly what observations are worth putting in writing, and which ones are better absorbed privately. I had been part of that system for 26 years. I had been a reliable producer of its expected outputs. What I was sitting with in the months between the first and second winter was the understanding that the system I worked in was not equipped to deal honestly with what I had found at my cabin, and that I was going to have to decide what I was going to do about that. I decided for the time being to keep documenting, to be the best observer I could be of whatever was happening on that piece of ground, and to think about what to do with the documentation later. The second winter was quieter and louder in different ways. Quieter because I had come prepared, and the preparedness changed how I moved through the experience. I had a trail camera on the east wall of the cabin and 2 more on the north and south fence lines. I had plaster, measuring equipment, a better camera. I had a framework for what I was looking at, even if the framework did not have a clean name. I was not being surprised anymore. I was observing. Louder because in the 2nd November, on the 4th night, I heard the vocalization. I have heard most of what the Ouachita produces at night across 26 years. Great horned owls, barred owls, coyote packs, bobcat screams, which will stop your heart the first time you hear one and merely startle you the 40th. And the occasional bellow of a bull elk from the isolated pockets where they persist in this range. None of that catalog contained what I heard from the North Ridge on the 4th night of the 2nd winter. It was long, and it descended in frequency across its duration, starting somewhere above the range of a human voice and falling through it and below it before ending. It had a resonance quality that told me about size. You can read lung capacity from vocalization if you have enough reference points. And the reference points I had said this was coming from something larger than a coyote, larger than a bobcat, larger than any canid or felid in my working knowledge. It was directional, from the North Ridge, from the approximate area where the trail had showed a pause in the February snow. It lasted perhaps 12 seconds. Then silence. Then from a different position on the ridge, west, maybe 300 yards from the first, a second vocalization, shorter, different in its frequency structure, a response rather than a call. 2 of them. 2 separate positions on the ridge above my cabin communicating in the dark on a November night. I sat at the table with my headlamp off, and I did not move for a long time. The trail cameras from the 2nd winter produced 4 images across 2 visits that I cannot account for with any animal in my professional catalog. 3 of them show a partial figure at the north fence line, a shoulder and upper arm in one, what appears to be a lower leg and foot in another, a dark mass against the lighter background of the fence line wire in the 3rd. The 4th image is the one I have spent the most time with. It was taken at 2:34 in the morning on the last night of my November visit, by the camera on the east wall, pointing north along the wall. In the upper right corner of the frame at the edge of the detection zone, there is a hand on the top log of the cabin wall. Not a paw, a hand. The thumb is visible on the near side of the log, the fingers on the far side, the grip relaxed, not gripping, just resting. The image is not sharp enough to give me the detail I would want, but the proportions are clear enough. Whatever placed that hand on the top log of my cabin wall at 2:34 in the morning was standing upright with its arm extended, and the hand at the end of that arm was large. I looked at that image for a long time before I understood what the posture implied. The camera is mounted at 7 feet. The top log of the cabin wall is at 8 feet 2 inches. Whatever was resting its hand on that log at a relaxed angle was doing so from above. It was taller than 8 feet 2 inches. That is when I started thinking seriously about what I was going to do with what I had accumulated. The third winter was the one that ended things. Not in a dramatic way, not an attack, not a confrontation. Nothing that would make a different kind of story. What happened in the third winter was smaller and harder to explain, and it has stayed with me in a way that the tracks and the vocalization and the handprint have not. I came out in December that year, earlier than usual the week before Christmas, because my schedule had shifted and December was what I had. The Ouachita in December is cold in that wet way it has, the hardwoods bare, the creek running full from the November rains, the ground soft and reading clearly. I set my cameras, put my gear away, made a fire, and went to sleep. In the morning there was something on the chopping block outside the south door. The chopping block is a section of white oak, cut 3 years ago from a tree that came down in a summer storm. Set outside the south door as a permanent fixture of the cabin yard. I use it to split kindling. I had split kindling on it the previous evening before dark and left it as I always leave it, clean bare, just the block and the axe handle leaning against the wall beside it. On the chopping block in the morning there were 3 objects, arranged in a line along the flat-top surface. A pinecone, loblolly, from the ridge above, the kind that litters the ground up there in December. A piece of white quartz, smooth about the size of a large egg, the kind that turns up in the creek bed but not in the cabin yard. And a segment of shed antler, white-tailed deer, a single tine about 8 inches long. 3 objects. On a flat surface I used every visit, arranged in a line. I stood in the cabin doorway in the December cold and I looked at those objects for a long time without going to them. The quartz had come from the creek bed, which was 140 yards from the chopping block and on the other side of the south fence line. Something, had gone to the creek, selected a piece of quartz and brought it to the chopping block and set it there alongside a pine cone from the ridge and a deer tine from wherever deer tines are found. Collected from 3 different locations, set in a line on a surface that was used and would be seen. That is not bear behavior. It is not deer behavior or coyote behavior or any behavior in my professional field guide. It is the behavior of something that collects objects and arranges them for purposes I cannot determine. And that had been watching this cabin for long enough to know which surfaces I used and which surfaces would be seen. I thought about leaving something in return. I did not that morning. I photographed the arrangement and measured the spacing between the objects, 11 inches between the pine cone and the quartz, 9 inches between the quartz and the antler tine. And I wrote it in the notebook and I went inside and made coffee and thought about what I was going to do with the rest of the day. What I did with the rest of that day was something I had not done before in 3 winters of visits. I sat outside. I pulled the camp chair from inside the cabin and set it in the yard facing south, with the creek drainage below me and the ridge behind me and the cabin wall to my left, and I sat there for most of the afternoon. Not doing anything, not watching the timber with any particular purpose, just being visible, being present in the open in a way that said, I am here. I am not hiding. I am not a threat. I am a person who comes to this piece of ground and uses a chopping block and splits kindling and sleeps in this structure. I am aware of how that reads. A retired wildlife officer sitting in a camp chair in a December clearing in the Ouachita National Forest, making himself visible to something he has been documenting for 3 winters and has never properly seen. I am aware of it. I sat there anyway for 4 hours until the light went and the cold got into my gear and I went inside. Nothing happened. I did not expect anything to happen. What I was doing was not expecting. It was something slower and less defined than that. It was the only gesture available to me that was not documentation, not measurement, not analysis. It was just presence, offered in return for 3 winters of being observed. What I did with the rest of the day after coming inside was walk the property slowly and think about 26 years of wildlife work and what I knew from them and what I did not know, and what the gap between those 2 things was now costing me. Here is what the gap was costing me. I had spent 26 years as a representative of a system whose institutional position on the question of whether something like a Sasquatch exists in North America is it does not. That position is not written down anywhere I am aware of. It does not need to be. It is embedded in the structure of the system, in what gets logged as a credible report and what does not, in what kinds of evidence trigger an investigation and what kinds do not, in the professional costs that accrue to an officer who files a report describing a large bipedal primate in the Ouachita National Forest. I knew those costs. I had seen them applied to a colleague years before who had made the mistake of putting something in writing that could not be taken back. I had 3 winters of field notes, a trail camera image of a hand on my cabin wall, track measurements, a handprint measurement, and a chopping block with 3 objects on it. None of it was going into any report. I knew that when I started keeping the notes and knowing it had not stopped me from keeping them, but standing in the December cold on the 3rd winter, I felt the weight of that knowledge in a new way. What I was carrying was real. What I was going to do with it within the institutional framework I worked in was nothing. And I was not sure, standing there, that I could continue to work within that framework while knowing that. I filed for retirement 4 months later. I did not give the real reason in the paperwork. The paperwork said knees and years of service. Both of those things are true. The paperwork did not say, I have spent 3 winters documenting something in the Ouachita National Forest that the institution I work for is structurally unable to acknowledge. And continuing to work for that institution while carrying that documentation privately has become a kind of dishonesty I am no longer willing to sustain. I could not have written that and kept my pension. So I wrote about my knees and my years of service, and both things were true, and I filed it, and I drove home, and I called my brother Raymond, and I told him what I had not told him across 3 winters. He listened without interrupting, which is not his natural tendency. And when I finished, he said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" And I said, "I needed to be sure first." And he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "I have 3 notebooks and a camera image, and I know what I spent 26 years learning to observe, and yes." Raymond came out to the cabin the following spring with me. He is not a wildlife professional. He runs a hardware business in Fort Smith. But he is a careful man who has been in this kind of country all his life, and he knows how to look at a piece of ground. He walked the property with me, looked at the locations I had documented, looked at the camera image on the laptop screen for a long time without saying anything. He said, "That is a hand." I said, "Yes." He said, "That is not a small hand." I said, "No." He did not say anything else for a while. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I do not know yet. I am starting by telling you that was 18 months ago. The objects on the chopping block are in a Ziploc bag in a drawer in my home office. The trail camera images are on an external drive in my desk. The field notebooks, 3 of them now, 1 per winter, are in a box on the shelf above the desk. I have shared the material with two people outside the family. A researcher named Clement Okafor, who works the Southeastern Documented Record and drove down from Memphis to look at everything I had, and a retired Arkansas game and fish biologist who asked not to be named and who said, after looking at the camera image and the track measurements, that the morphology was consistent with documented material from the Ozark Plateau accounts, and that the object arrangement was unlike anything in his 30 years of wildlife documentation from this region. Clement said the camera image was the clearest documentation of a hand on a structure he had encountered in the Eastern record, and that the object arrangement on the chopping block was consistent with behavior documented in other long-term habituation accounts from this region and from the Pacific Northwest. He also said, habituation accounts are the most complicated category in the documented record, because what they describe is not an encounter. They describe a relationship, and a relationship has implications that a single encounter does not. I have thought about that word a great deal since he said it. Relationship. It implies two parties with ongoing awareness of each other, whose behavior is shaped by that awareness. It implies that what was coming to the cabin was coming to the cabin in part because of me. Not just because the structure existed, but because I existed, because I kept returning, because there was a specific person who came back to this piece of ground in the Ouachita Mountains every winter, and whose patterns had been observed and catalogued in the same way I had been observing and cataloging. I had spent 3 winters documenting something. It had spent 3 winters documenting me. I do not know what to do with that. I am working on it. I still go to the cabin. I went last December, the first winter since the retirement. And I left the cameras up and I sat at the table and I listened to the Ouachita at night and I thought about what 26 years of work had and had not taught me. The cameras caught nothing that winter. The chopping block was empty every morning. The North Ridge was quiet. I do not know if the absence means it was not there, or if it means it was there and chose not to announce itself. Those are two very different things, and I cannot tell them apart from the evidence I have. I have spent 26 years learning to read evidence, and this is the thing the evidence will not tell me. I left a piece of white quartz on the chopping block when I drove out in December, the same size as the one that had been left for me, from the same creek bed. I do not know if it was still there when the next storm came through. I do not know if anything came to the block after I left and found it and understood what it meant. I do not know if understanding is even the right word for what something like that might do with an object left by a person it has been watching. What I know is what I observed across 3 winters in the Ouachita Mountains, documented in 3 notebooks in a box on a shelf in my office, and what those observations cost me in terms of a career and a framework and a professional identity that I had been building for 26 years. That is a real cost. I am not pretending it is not. I am also not pretending that the cost was wrong to pay, because pretending that would require me to pretend that what I observed was not real, and I am not able to do that. The Ouachita in December is cold and wet, and the hardwoods are bare, and the creek runs full, and the ridge above the cabin holds its dark in a specific way that I have been reading for 20 years. I know that country, I know what is in it. Some of what is in it I am still learning to name.